Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our next module where we're going to talk about the nervous, endocrine and cardiovascular systems. Okay, so within this video we're going to talk about these things and not in too much depth because we'll get into the more nitty-gritty of these systems when we go through the modules and how these systems are affected by resistance training. So in this video we're going to look at the structure of the nervous system, and we're going to talk in some detail about nerve signal transmission, so how one nerve or neuron is, or neuron depending on your pronunciation, is transmitted from one to another. Okay, so we're not going to talk about muscle activation or anything like that within this module. We'll come on to that later on in when we talk about motor physiology. Okay, so we're also going to talk about the cardiovascular system and things about the regulation of cardiac output. So just things to consider in terms of, when we're training and what stress we put on the cardiovascular system, how that comes about, and how the body regulates cardiac output. And then finally we're going to jump onto the endocrine system. I'm going to try and keep this section short and sweet within this one because we do cover this again later on in more depth, again relating more to resistance training. I'm going to talk about location of glands, tropic hormones, so hormones that kind of work systemically throughout the body and sort of transmit hormonal signals in between glands. And then we're going to talk about the difference between autocrine and paracrine glands. So we'll start with the nervous system. Okay, we're going to try and keep this really simple. So we're going to look at this from two perspectives. We're going to talk about the central nervous system, and then we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system as well. So your central nervous system is basically the control center of your body and includes your brain. It includes your spinal cord. It also includes your not optic nerve, your retina as well. So it controls part of the eye. And then your peripheral nervous system is basically anything that isn't part of the central nervous system. So this includes basically nerves to and from organs, to and from muscles, so on and so forth. So the job of your peripheral nervous system is really to relay information to and from the central nervous system. So your central nervous system does all the controlling and the processing. Your peripheral nervous system does all the fetching and carrying, as it were. So your peripheral nervous system, your PNS, is then really broken down into two parts. So we have our afferent division, or our sensory division, which again, as the name suggests, it senses, detects changes within the body that then relays signals back to the peripheral nervous system, and that goes up to the central nervous system, where our control centers then make some kind of formed or even uninformed decision. Okay, and then the peripheral nervous system then has its output component. So the afferent is its input component, and the efferent is the output component, and that's also known as the motor division. Okay, so that's then taking those signals from the brain after our decision's been made down through our peripheral nervous system to then create some kind of response. Now that response can be one of two things, which can be somatic or it can be autonomic. Somatic is something that is generally voluntary as well. So there are some crossovers between somatic and autonomic. So there's certain things like heart rate is controlled autonomically, so that means that it's under subconscious control or unconscious control, but at times we can slow our heart rate down. Okay, so that's an obvious thing. So there is some crossover between these things. Somatic is things that we would consciously do. So if we're going to try and kick a ball or throw a ball or whatever, or we're going to decide to close our eyes, those sort of things are under somatic control. But then there's always crossover with the autonomic as well. So somatic control over the autonomic system is actually quite useful in some sports. So if we think about biathlon, which is where you ski cross country and then the athlete then stops and shoots, their heart rate is obviously going to be very high from the skiing component. So then they need to slow their heart rate down very quickly to be able to compose themselves to actually shoot at a target. So we can actually use these things to our advantage, and there's many systems and many things that actually we can use in terms of control of breathing to actually create a response within the body that would typically be seen as autonomic, but we can actually get that to work in our favor sometimes. And then the autonomic system is then broken down further into what are your sympathetic nerves and your parasympathetic nerves. Okay, so sympathetic generally has what's called an excitatory response, so it will cause a stimulate or an upregulation in something. So if we get stimulation of, let's say, an adrenal gland from the central nervous system, that will increase adrenal output. Parasympathetic, they tend to have the opposite effect. So sympathetic might increase blood flow to a tissue if we were exercising, whereas your parasympathetic, it's easy for me to say, will actually reduce that blood flow to a certain tissue as well. So they generally work in opposition to each other to either increase things when we need it, or then when we're done with it, decrease things in that nature there. And they then provide like some link between the nervous system and our endocrine system as well. So your sympathetic part of your autonomic system actually has links with your endocrine system as well. So that's how we get overall regulation control. So the nervous system is a very quick response, quick fire kind of response to any sort of internal or external impact on the body, whereas our endocrine system typically, and I say typically because it's not always the case, is a much slower over time kind of change on the body, and sort of more of a long-term control mechanism to maintain homeostasis. So we need to consider these things when we're talking about responses to exercise, and how actually long we can take to sort of affect these changes, and how we can use these to our advantages and disadvantages. So we're going to move on to nerve signal transmission now. So stick with me on this one because it gets quite complex. So we now know that the different parts of the nervous system are all connected, and how do they connect to each other? So if we look at our diagram in front of us, and we look at the image on the far left, we have our neuron, or our nerve cell, okay? And we've got three main parts of the nerve cell that we really want to look at. So we've got the top bit, which has got the nucleus, and the soma, which is the which is the cell body. And in that we have these dendrites. Now these dendrites are like finger-like projections which then link to other nerves, okay? And then we have, coming into that part of the cell, we have what are called presynaptic terminals. Now these are the neurotransmitter components of other cells, and it's these neurotransmitters that transmit chemical information from one nerve cell to another to pass a signal down. And in this part of the cell, we do a process called integration takes place. So it integrates information from other cells, so we can have information from multiple nerve cells coming into one cell body. Okay, within that sort of cell body, the main head bit of the neuron, we have a place called the axon hillock. Okay, now this is important because it's important in spike initiation, and what that means, and we'll talk about this in a bit more depth in a second, is that when neurotransmitters attach to our cell body, this causes gates to open that changes an influx of chemicals and neurotransmitters into the head of the head of the nerve. A nerve signal will only be passed down the axon, which is the really long thin bit, which has got the myelin sheath that you can see drawn there, with the impulse conduction. That will only conduct an impulse once this spike initiation has taken place. So think of this as like a reservoir being full, and then it's only once it's full that it can overflow, okay? And once it can overflow, then that nerve impulse can then be passed down the neuron. Once it's gone down the neuron, down the axon, we'll talk about the mechanisms by which that takes place. It then gets to our axon terminals, and in our axon terminals there are neurotransmitters which are then released, and then that will connect to it, they will be released, into the synaptic junction, or the synaptic cleft as it's called, okay, which we'll look at again in the next image, into the synaptic cleft, which then binds to the cell body of the adjacent nerve cells as well, okay? So the main thing to take from that is there's the sort of four main stages. So we have integration, which is the joining of other cells. We have the spike initiation, which is creating that reservoir of energy with which to trigger a nerve impulse. And then we have impulse conduction, which then transmits the signal down the axon body, and then to the end of that axon, which has then got the axon terminals, which then release neurotransmitters, which then carry on that reaction. So how does this take place? Well, fundamentally, inside of our cell is full of potassium, and our outside of our cell is full of sodium. Okay, so sodium is positively charged, as is potassium, and what we need is a shift of sodium outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And what this does is it changes what's called the membrane potential, okay, or the resting cell membrane potential. Now, although they're both positively charged, there is a lot of other ions and other sort of chemicals and various proteins and so on and so forth, which actually mean that the inside of the cell is relatively negatively charged compared to the outside of the cell as well, okay? So what happens when these if we go to the next image, in the middle, and we can see the presynaptic neuron. So these are in the axon terminals of 1. So if we look at point number 1, we have this nerve impulse coming down. Okay, and what this nerve impulse does when it gets to the end is it activates these voltage gate calcium channels. So what these are is just basically pathways that allow calcium to enter into the axon terminals, okay, or into the synaptic region, okay, the synaptic end bulb. Sorry, is as it's noted there. When calcium is then enters these cells, these synaptic end bulbs, this causes these little pods of neurotransmitters called synaptic vesicles to release their neurotransmitters, okay, and they release them into what's the synaptic cleft, which is the gap between the axon terminal of one neuron and the cell body of the next, okay. These neurotransmitters then cross this cleft, so we're going on towards step 4 now, okay, and then these then open these, they're called Ligand gated channel. We'll talk about more about these channels later on when we talk about cell signal transmission. And these allow sodium to enter into the next cell, so then next cell body. Okay? So then what we do is then we start to then build the integration again, so more sodium floods in until we get to the point where the axon hillock detects this and it builds up again and again and again. And if we go down to our right image on the bottom of the screen there, you can see the incoming signal from the dendrite. We get a passive spread of those signals throughout that. We get a build-up of sodium within the soma or the cell body, and then this then propagates an action potential down the cell. So now we know how one cell transmits a nerve impulse to another, and we also understand how it's initiated within the cell body to actually create a trigger to create an actually excitatory response, which then passes a nerve impulse down the cell body. But what this doesn't tell us is exactly how the nerve impulse is transmitted down the axon to the axon terminal. So we're going to talk about that a little bit now. Okay, so we've dealt with the sort of perpetuation of the signal throughout the cell body and the stimulation of the axon hillock to allow an influx of sodium into that region, and that change in sodium allows for a change in membrane potential or action potential across the cell membrane, which then allows an electrical signal to travel down the axon. Okay, and basically, as we've discovered for that bit, it basically continues down the full length of the axon body, so the long, thin, twiggy bit in the middle there. So if we look at our diagram on the left-hand side, we've got two different types of conduction. So A, if you look at the bottom there, is continuous conduction, and B is saltatory conduction. So in both cases, this is still involved with the influx of sodium into that part of the cell, and the influx of sodium then opens more gates in the sort of the next compartment, as it were, or the next part of the cell, the next gate along, to allow more sodium to flood in, more sodium to flood in, and more sodium to flood in. And this is called depolarization. So we're changing the membrane potential across the cell to make it less negative. So we're increasing the positive potential across that cell. Okay, so in continuous conduction, which is A, you can see that it just goes along, so it just basically, the leading edge of the action potential just transmits along in a nice linear fashion and just moves along the axon body right the way down until it reaches the axon terminals, and then, like we said before, it's passed on. But if we look at B, there's a type of conduction called saltatory conduction. This works slightly differently, and this is because on this type of neuron we have these myelin sheaths, okay? So that's the little red lines there, and there's a little gaps in between them. If you look at the top image of that one under B, they're called the nodes of Ranvier. Now these nodes are areas that build up electrical charge, basically, and when it reaches a certain potential, it almost jumps across these sort of gaps into these nodes, so you actually get a much quicker transmission. So there's an initial build-up, but those sodium signals and those sodium channels, they jump across so that you get a much quicker transmission of the action potential along the axon. So if you look now in the middle at the time, so at 1 millisecond they're roughly in the same position, our leading edge of the action potential, and at 5 they're sort of comparable, but then as we get towards 10 milliseconds, you can see that these big jumps that the saltatory conduction takes place actually transmits nerves quicker. So these myelin sheaths, which were on the previous segment of the video on that on that neuron diagram. So take a look at that, and you'll see these are on that one. They're not on all nerve cells, but the nerve cells that do have them tend to conduct nerve impulses quicker. Okay, so they're in parts of the body where obviously we're going to need those quick nerve impulses. Okay, so how does this relate to actually changes in our membrane potential? So we've talked about the influx of sodium, and that increases our membrane potential. So if we look at the graph on the right hand side, if we've got our resting potential is actually around minus 70 millivolts. Okay, so a very, very, very small membrane potential. It's actually a negative potential, but we're still making it more positive by the influx of sodium. So if we look at our resting potential arrow there, we can see that on the graph, and that's just where it is. And then when a signal comes down, we then start to get that build up of sort of transmission of sodium and the transmitters across the cell body, which then builds up towards the Axon-Hillock kind of threshold. You know, we talked about it being the dam and the reservoir for then that cascade of influx of sodium, and that's the threshold potential. So it's once that threshold potential is breached, which is around about minus, I think it's 55 millivolts. Once that's breached, once there's enough sodium inside the cell to actually then perpetuate the movement and influx of sodium down the rest of the nerve, then we start to get what's called depolarization. Okay, and then we get more and more and more sodium entering the axon part of the neuron. We get that transmission of the electrical impulse down the cell membrane, and that's, like I say, is called depolarization. And it's also known as an action potential. Okay, and it's an action potential because obviously it's a change in electrical potential, which is a shift in the voltage potential, and it creates an action. It's as simple as that, really. And then once the signal stops being transmitted, we get then repolarization. So during repolarization, there's no more neurotransmitters binding to the cell body, which then creates that release of increase of sodium into there, which then creates that cascade event of sodium traveling down, changing the membrane potential, so on and so forth. That process then stops, and then we have a process by where potassium then re-enters the cell, okay, and sodium then leaves the cell, and this is called repolarization. Okay, so if we look on our graph there now, so we've had our depolarization from around about 2.5 milliseconds to around about 3.5 milliseconds, and then repolarization, once that signal stopped, then starts to drop down towards its resting potential. And you do get this period around about 5 milliseconds there, which is called hyperpolarization, which is just where there's almost like an overshoot of restoring that resting membrane potential, and it goes back to there. So now we've discussed how nerves are transmitted from one neuron to the next, and the mechanisms that are in play, and the sort of chemicals that are in play as well. So obviously sodium and potassium are essential to that. In terms of cell signaling, there's calcium is important for the release of those sort of what are they called? Neurotransmitters. Sorry, apologies. Once those cell transmitters are released from the axon terminal, you know, they're then restored, so they're then brought back into those vesicles, those little pods that contain those neurotransmitters, until they're stimulated again to be released. So they're recycled, obviously. I mean, there's a few neurotransmitters that we'd be particularly interested in. Variations on adrenaline are neurotransmitters, so it's not just a hormone in that sense. It has like a dual function. But the ones that we're sort of interested in are things like acetylcholine is an important one, which is for muscle transmission as well. So that one tends to work a lot within the neuromuscular junction. Now, the neuromuscular junction is the point at which our nerves then reach their axon terminals, will then reach the actual the muscle tissue itself. Okay, and then that will then cause innervation. So I think it's the next module actually, we're going to talk about motor physiology, and motor physiology is fundamentally about how these signals being transmitted from nerves then create movement. Okay, and that's actually it's for me, it's a little bit easier to understand than this, so hopefully it will be the same for you. But this isn't too complex, so just to go over it one more time, it's basically the influx of sodium into a cell, which is triggered by neurotransmitters opening gateways, then changes the membrane potential across the cell. This membrane potential is a change in electrical potential. This potential then travels down the axon until it gets to the end of the axon in the axon terminal, which then stimulates the release of neurotransmitters from these little vesicles, which then create the same effect on the next neuron, or in muscle tissue, or any other organ when we get to that point there. Okay, so now we've done with the nerve signal transmission. We're going to move on to Okay, so now we've dealt with the nervous system, we're going to look a little bit about how the nervous system integrates to control heart rate. Now, obviously, the nervous system integrates with many of the systems of the body, including, like, it controls breathing, things like that as well. And I'm using this not necessarily as an example of something that I think is particularly important. Obviously, heart rate is important. We all need a heartbeat to live. But it's just an example of how the nervous system can interact with other organs in order to get a response that creates a feedback loop between the organ itself and the response that we then get from the central nervous system. So if we look at the diagram on our left, we can see, if we look at point number 1, if we're looking at heart, we've got these baroreceptors that detect changes in arterial pressure. That was easy for me to say. Baroreceptors are basically pressure receptors. The word baro, in scientific terms, regardless of field, relates typically to pressure. So a barometer, for example, would measure air pressure, which is obviously used in weather forecasting and stuff like that as well. Now, when there's a detection in change in arterial pressure, these physical changes, these mechanical changes, are related into electrical signals through transmitters and such, and this is sent through the glossopharyngeal nerve all the way up to the medulla in the brain, the brainstem. Okay, and this is the medulla in the part of the brain there is responsible for this processing. So if we're exercising, it's going to detect the change in pressure in the arteries. Now, initially that pressure might fall slightly because the muscles are now taking up blood, so therefore arterial pressure might drop ever so slightly. So then that signal gets sent up to the brain. The brain says, hang on, arterial pressure is dropping, so now I'm going to send a signal down my valgus nerve to what is known as my sinoatrial node. Okay, I can never say sinoatrial properly, don't know why. Sinoatrial node, or your SA node, and this is the pacemaker of the heart. And in this example we've just given here, obviously if blood pressure is falling, we need to increase heart rate, we need to increase the volume of blood leaving the heart, so heart rate will then increase as well. Okay, so the sinoatrial node is basically responsible for the initiation and maintenance of heartbeat. So when someone has a heart problem or a heart defect where they can't regulate their heartbeat, that's why they put in a pacemaker. So that's what a pacemaker does. It's exactly the same job, but from a man-made mechanical perspective as opposed to our natural regulation of these things. Now, what's cool about the sinoatrial node is it then causes a sort of proliferation throughout the cardiac tissue, because obviously we don't just want one part of the heart contracting. So it's located in the right atrium of the heart, but we don't just obviously want the right atrium contracting. We want the whole heart contracting together, and on the next slide we'll show you why. But we want that as a nice coordinated contraction. So there's a kind of a signal that then perpetuates throughout the heart, which then creates a simultaneous contraction, so we get blood leaving or entering the chambers of the heart at the same time. Okay, so we get that kind of synergistic response as well. So there's not parts of the heart which are full of blood while others aren't, or bits that are empty which the others are full, so on and so forth. Right, okay, so we'll move on to that bit now. Okay, so now we'll move on to the heart and how it functions really, and where the blood goes, as it were. So if we look at our diastole condition, when our heart's filling up, we actually fill our heart up, depending on the side of the heart, with either oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. So as we're looking at this, or imagine we're looking into the human body, so right and left are obviously the wrong way round. So in the human body, our right ventricle or our right side of the heart is going to be getting deoxygenated blood, and that deoxygenated blood is going to be coming from our vena cava, okay, which is basically coming from the rest of the tissues in the body that have used up all the oxygen, and now it's going into that to fill up to then be pumped elsewhere. So where is the deoxygenated blood going to be pumped? Well, eventually, when it contracts, it's going to be pumped from the pulmonary artery to the lungs to be oxygenated, okay? So if we just concentrate on the blue for now, we can see that on the diastole diagram on the left of the page, that our right ventricle is now filling up, okay? And if we then swap over quickly to the systole diagram on the right-hand side of the page, as that then contracts, as our right ventricle then contracts, you can see the blood then leaves the heart out through our pulmonary artery to our lungs to be oxygenated, okay? So that's the path of deoxygenated blood. So what's the path of oxygenated blood? Well, the oxygenated blood, if we go back to the diastole now, when it's filling up, the oxygenated blood is now that same blood that's just come from the lungs, that's just been oxygenated, that we've just talked about, and that then comes down the pulmonary veins, and that comes through our left atrium into our left ventricle, right? So now when that left ventricle is full, we're then going to go to the systole condition. So we're going to jump back over to the right hand side of the diagram. When that contracts, that blood then is going to be forced out of the left ventricle through the aorta, and that is going to go and oxygenate the tissues throughout the rest of the body. So our aorta is a really powerful kind of, I guess, arterial pathway, because it has to take a lot of pressure. So important things in this condition are, if we look at our valves, we've got our sort of semi-lunar valves on the diagram for diastole that are noted there, and these are obviously closed at certain points, because at certain times during the contraction we want blood to not go up a certain way. So we don't want blood leaving the heart as it's filling up, we only want it to leave once we've contracted it. And then obviously once the heart is contracting, the atrioventricular valve, you can see there, closes over in both chambers of the heart, so in the left and right, to stop blood coming out the way it's just blood leaving the way it's just entered. So we don't want that, okay? So that's how it's controlled. So that's a basic overview of how blood is circulated around the body and how it's oxygenated as well. So just take a few seconds to have a look at that. If you didn't understand what I said, it should be pretty self-explanatory. Just follow the arrows. And then what we're interested in here in terms of cardiac output is what is called the stroke volume. So basically, that's the amount of blood that enters the heart when it's filling minus the amount of blood that has left the heart when it's contracted, okay? So your end diastolic volume is when your heart is full, and your systolic volume is what's left after it's contracted. So you might assume that when your heart contracts, all the blood leaves the heart. This isn't true, okay? The amount of blood that leaves the heart will be dependent on the force of the contraction, right? So the harder we have to work, the harder that contraction is going to be. That's why when you exercise with higher intensity, you feel your heart beating harder, okay? The end diastolic volume, obviously, that's likely to remain relatively constant, because your heart is going to fill up or genuinely be full most of the time as well. There wouldn't be a point where it would really regulate that, but the amount that leaves the heart will change depending on how hard it pumps. Okay, so we're going to move. Okay, so now we're going to talk about cardiac output. Okay, so why is cardiac output important? Well, it can be a useful tool for a number of reasons. Primary ones being it's an indicator of performance as well. So the two factors that really influence cardiac output, if we look at the bottom, of that little flow chart there, are heart rate and stroke volume. Now, as trainers, we can't really measure stroke volume. It's a very difficult thing to measure. So if your stroke volume, if you go one line above that, so we're working backwards up this, is the equivalent of your end diastolic volume minus your end systolic volume, okay? So it's basically the amount of blood that leaves the heart with each contraction. We can't really measure that unless we've got advanced scientific equipment. We can't really do that. But what we can measure is heart rate. So heart rate is a measure of fitness. We use it for training zones. We use it for everything else as well. So if we're looking for improvement in heart rate, we can see that someone's resting heart rate is lowering down. It generally indicates they're fitter in some way. It might be they've got a medical condition, so always be aware of that. But if you're training a client and you take regular heart rate measurements and their resting heart rate is low, and it's usually an indicator that the heart is working better, so the heart is contracting harder, the heart is maybe improved in its function. So those things can affect stroke volume. So your heart rate lowering can be an indicator that your cardiac output's got to remain the same, therefore something has happened as an adaptation in the stroke volume. But you need to be careful with that as well, because some adaptations that can affect stroke volume that might be seen as positive. So, for example, if your heart size increases, okay, so if we look at the factors affecting stroke volume little block there, heart size increasing is something that happens with a lot of athletes, which is why their resting heart rate is lower, because their hearts are bigger and they can contract better and they have a better duration of contraction. Therefore, the heart rate has to be lower. Now, ultimately, this isn't to maintain the same cardiac output as someone who's got less heart size, less contractibility, and less duration of contraction, okay? Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but it's not necessarily good either. In people who have what's called athlete's heart syndrome, which is like a really enlarged heart, so endurance athletes can be victim of this. You know, if that's combined with other medical conditions, it can be dangerous to actually have a lower heart rate, because your heart rate still needs to be able to contract a regular rate to obviously maintain blood flow. And if it gets too low and there's obstructions that are not necessarily linked to your training but to other medical conditions, this can be problematic, okay? So heart rate is a positive thing. The other thing we can do with heart rate, if we can control heart rate, we know that our cardiac output is going to be higher, but heart rate is obviously an indicator of workload. So one of the philosophies that Neil has, and why we like to use, say, the week 3 workouts, forget about the muscle fiber targeting population stuff for a second, we'll talk about that later, but what it does do is it is cardiovascularly demanding. So if you're training at these higher intensities, if you're training with these shortened rest periods and these higher volumes, you are going to put stress on your heart, and that is going to have some positive effects. So you don't necessarily need to do cardiovascular work to improve the heart's function. You can do that by using high intensity activity as well. So you're going to create an adaptation. So we're going to jump back up to the top now, and I'll show you why this takes place, or what mechanisms by which is going to force this adaptation, and why resistance training is going to do that. So if you consider that the body contains around 77 millilitres per kilogram of blood, so a 100 kilogram person is going to have about 7.7 litres. So we'll call that around about 8 litres of blood approximately. And if we know our cardiac output is our stroke volume times our heart rate, because we've just talked about that, then at rest, our cardiac output is going to be 70 millilitres, which is about the average amount of blood that leaves the heart for most people when it contracts under normal conditions, times 70 beats per minute. So that's around about 5 litres a minute of blood leaving the heart, which means if you've got 8 litres of blood, that means that every blood cell in your body is going around the body, doing its thing, picking up oxygen, dropping oxygen off about once every minute and a half, which I think is quite impressive, really. Now, if we go into high intensity activity, where your cardiac output might be 130 millilitres a minute, and you're talking about 190 beats per minute, this would be on the upper end of the spectrum of where that's going to cause a cardiac output of 24 litres per minute. So that means every minute, every red blood cell in your body is zooming around your body, doing its thing 3 times a minute, which I think is massively impressive. But it's also one of the reasons why red blood cells are turned over at a regular rate. It's why when you give blood, if you donate blood, that your blood cells are produced and come back almost within a few days, because, like I say, your body has a capacity to produce them at this rate, and that's basically down to the physiological need for that to take place, because they do get worn out, they do work hard. So when we're talking about resistance training, we're talking about high intensity stuff. Yes, we're not talking about doing various high intensity cardiovascular work, but if we increase our volume in terms of how many repetitions we're doing, and we're doing drop sets and rest sets, there's no way that that's not going to affect our cardiac output, okay? It's going to improve our heart rate. So we can actually, if we then go back to the fact it's affecting heart rate, we can improve our fitness levels by placing stress on our cardiovascular system by using resistance training. And by doing that, and by training harder in resistance training, it will have some benefit for those who want to diet for bodybuilding contests, for example, of actually reducing the amount of cardiovascular exercise you need to do. I mean, on a personal level, I've swapped between bodybuilding and powerlifting for a number of months. And without changing much in terms of my calorie intake, I can actually lose body fat when I change my training more back to a higher volume bodybuilding style than a powerlifting style. Why? Because my training volume's higher, so I'm burning more calories, but also I'm putting more stress on my cardiovascular system, so I'm burning more calories, not just in the training session, but in that period afterwards when I'm using what's called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So when you perform high intensity activity, your oxygen demand, your fat burning demand, is actually increased for a period of time after you finish training, compared to, say, lower intensity exercises as well. Okay, so that even includes things like steady state cardio. Yes, you're getting more of a calorie burn, but ultimately you're not getting that same what's called EPOC, which is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So if you want to do some reading into that, then do it. And all these things are going to force positive adaptations in most people. There are obviously other things that can affect your heart rate. So we've got things like your age, obviously, is one. So the older you get, the lower your maximum heart rate will be, typically. And then if we look on autonomic innervation, so things that are going to affect your nervous system. So that might not seem like it's relevant because it's autonomic, but there's things that can affect that system, such as caffeine can have an effect. So if you've got someone who's got naturally high heart rate or suffers with any heart palpitations, maybe giving them caffeine is not a good idea. Hormones, caffeine helps stimulate the release of adrenaline, which is why it causes the increase in heart rate, partially anyway. So you've got these hormones as well that can actually affect heart rate, and these hormones that affect heart rate can actually be affected by things not just by training but also by diet as well. So we'll talk a little bit about those when we move more onto the sort of endocrine specific stuff to do with bodybuilding. So yeah, we've dealt with cardiac output. I think you now see why it's important and how we can use at least one component of our cardiac output as an indicator of improvement within clients, and also as a guideline for how our training intensity should be for fat loss. Okay, so it's not necessarily that your heart rate has to go really high, but your heart rate should be going above 150, 160 beats per minute in at least a few of your resistance training sessions. Try doing that and see how quickly your body composition changes. So you can get that cardiovascular effect of the fat burning and the energy demand from just training, increasing your training intensity. And by that I don't mean increasing the weight, which is the classical definition of intensity. I mean that in the sense of you're reducing your rest periods, and you're going to increase the volume of work you're doing at a lighter weight to make it more of a cardiovascular exercise. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the final part in this little module video. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I could talk about the endocrine system all day, and the reason for that is many of the processes and adaptations that we want to force through either bodybuilding or diet are actually governed through the endocrine system more so than the central nervous system, because we're talking about long-term regulation of the body and homeostasis here, and changes in those nutrient fluxes and those energy fluxes, and all that stuff is generally governed long-term by the endocrine system. Okay. So briefly go through it now. So we've got our hypothalamus, which is the brain region that controls the pituitary gland. So that's like our master controller. Okay, that's the bit that one of the former students said is the daddy of the brain. It does all the controlling of everything that goes on. And your pituitary gland is then the part of the brain which then is the kind of your main signaler. So that sends off the signals to do what the hypothalamus tells it to do. Okay. And many of the hormones that the pituitary gland releases are tropic hormones, so they go and they affect other glands. So you have like thyroid stimulating hormone, for example, which then stimulates the thyroid gland to release more thyroid hormones if there's a detection of low thyroid within the blood. So there's all this feedback mechanism going on, and this release and then this inhibition dependent on how much of each hormone is in the blood, how quickly the body is using those hormones, how much stress the body is under, and so on and so forth. Again, we'll get back into that in more depth when we talk about more specifically on the endocrine and responses to resistance training stuff as well. I'll do some interesting things about diet as well, and how these affect hormones, and things to consider if you're going to initiate your own fat loss programs, or your own fat loss programs, particularly for women, because they tend to be more hormonally sensitive than men, which is why they tend to find that fat loss doesn't come as easy for them. Anyway, bit of a distraction there, but yeah, we'll talk about that in greater depth anyway. So then we've got our thyroid gland, which is fundamentally responsible for the release of T3 and T4. So T4 is the most abundant one in the body, but T3 is the most active one. So T4 is generally converted to T3, which is then the one that acts to regulate metabolism. So when you've got hypothyroidism, which means you've got low thyroid, that's when it's a medical condition by where people gain body fat easily. Hyperthyroidism, people struggle to gain weight because their energy producing cells basically just get through fuel at an accelerated rate, so they struggle to gain weight because their body just burns off fuel at an accelerated rate. So thyroid as well, your thyroid hormones are also massively important in terms of they can influence muscle loss and fat mobilization and so on and so forth. And then you have your parathyroids, which produce a hormone calcitonin, which helps regulate calcium in the blood. Calcium is already discovered within this module is important for cell signal transmission, and obviously bone formation as well. So it's calcium is a very, very, very important thing to consider in terms of a nutrient we need in a diet, not just for bone health but for other sort of signaling functions as well. And we'll talk about that more when we get onto motor physiology, because it's essential for muscle contractions. And then we have the adrenal glands, which are produce primarily your corticosteroids. So you've got produces adrenaline, obviously, as the name suggests, but then you have aldosterone, you have your water regulating hormones like aldosterone, you have cortisol. It produces some testosterone, I think, particularly in women. So yeah, you've got your steroid hormones there. Then you have your testes in men, which is obviously testosterone, and then your ovaries, which is primarily if you've got your female sex hormones, so estrogen, the different types of estrogen as well. And then we have pancreas, which is a really, really important organ for us because that helps regulate the level of sugar in the blood. So it actually releases insulin if we've got high blood sugar to actually put that into storage, because glucose, people don't really realize this, is actually toxic. That's not to say you should avoid carbohydrate. I'd just like to say that for now. It's just that glucose, if not regulated or at higher levels, is actually toxic to tissues. It's why diabetics actually get what's called diabetic neuropathy, where they actually lose limbs because their blood flow isn't right. It's partly due to lack of blood flow, and it's also partly to do with that the blood doesn't deal with glucose very well, so therefore the body doesn't deal with glucose very well, therefore they get the toxins in the system cause limb loss as well. So it's a horrible thing to have in people who've got severe diabetes. So we've also got glucagon that's released from the pancreas, which then stimulates the liver to release stored glycogen. So if we've got low blood sugar for whatever reason, we've not had many carbohydrates that day, our blood sugar is low, we need to maintain a certain level of glucose because it's essential for various functions within the body. Then we need to be able to manage that on both ways. So not really gone too much into the specifics of the hormones that I mentioned there, because we're going to talk about those now. But that's the basic overview of the system, and the ones that are really important, really, in terms of consideration, are control the pituitary gland. So any hormone that has a feedback mechanism with the pituitary gland is important because they can all sort of interfere with each other, and I'll show you how that takes place again later on. So you can see that how playing with one hormone can have massive implications with another, so that we need to be careful when we're doing things with diet, because we can actually have massive knock-on effects that we may not want, and actually can be very difficult for someone to recover from if we're not careful. So we'll talk about anabolic hormones now. So anabolic is tissue building and cellular growth. It's not just muscle growth, okay? Anabolic can be fat tissue, adipose tissue. If you're laying down body fat, that's an anabolic process. And we're going to talk very briefly about how these hormones are influenced by exercise. So this will come into one of your assignments, okay? This is a very brief snippet of this. Your assignment will be in a lot more detail, obviously. So insulin levels decrease with exercise, especially in the acute period. So exercise in itself, and again we'll talk about this in greater depth later on, actually improves your insulin response. So high insulin isn't necessarily a problem, it's just that we don't want it too high for too long, because it can stop fat burning, it can mess up your insulin sensitivity, and that can have, you know, implications for health, for diabetes, and for fat loss as well. So it increases glucose, amino acid, and fatty acid uptake. So it's a storage hormone, as it's commonly referred to. So insulin allows transportation of glucose inside the cells of the body, to primarily your liver and your muscles. It allows the transportation of amino acids. So although insulin gets a bad reputation because, you know, when it's high, it increases fatty acid uptake. So therefore, you know, people get fatter, apparently. We'll talk about this again in more depth. Amino acids, again, obviously important for muscle building, and actually insulin is muscle protective as well. So if your insulin levels are a bit higher, muscle protein breakdown, the breakdown of muscle doesn't take place at nearly the same rate. So it's actually an important one to consider, to bring in if you've got someone who's got very low body fat percentages, to raise their insulin before they train, to actually help preserve muscle in those later stages of dieting, or if someone's on a particularly low calorie diet as well. So insulin's an important one. Resistance training improves sensitivity in the short term, which is why a lot of people take a lot of carbohydrates around their training, even when they're dieting, simply because, one, it protects muscle, like I just said, but two, your body actually transports nutrients in more efficiently. Again, we'll talk about that in more depth later on. Testosterone in the acute phase after training, it increases with exercise, and it stimulates your muscle growth. It's linked with decreases in body fat, and it increases your red blood cells. Obviously, red blood cells are important with exercise because you're going to turn them over a lot quicker. So that's where that relationship comes in. And then we've got growth hormone. Again, that's increased in the acute phase after exercise. And there's different sort of isomers of growth hormones with different types. So some are released almost immediately within the cells themselves, like mechanogrowth factors, which I've talked about in one of the modules books later on. And it's important for tissue growth. It mobilizes fatty acids for energy. It decreases glucose uptake, which again allows for more energy to be produced. And then it also increases gluconeogenesis, which gluconeogenesis is the the creation of glucose from non-glucose sources. So glucose, although it's seen as obviously from carbohydrate, it can actually be made from certain amino acids, and it can actually be made from the glycerol backbone of fatty acids as well. So when we get onto the nutrition modules, you'll see all that stuff, and it's all described there anyway. And then later on down the line, it stimulates IGF-1, which is, again, an important hormone, which is insulin growth like factor 1, and the name suggests, it has some effects similar to insulin. In terms of its anabolism and its capacity to produce muscle and uptake certain nutrients, so on and so forth. Okay, so we'll move on to the catabolic hormones now. There's quite a few of these. So we'll talk about how resistance training affects them. So catabolic is basically a tissue or cellular breakdown, okay? So we have glucagon, which increases with exercise. Now this makes sense because glucagon's role is to actually release to increase glycogen breakdown from the liver to maintain blood glucose levels. So obviously glycogen is the stored form of glucose. So that's just going to really help maintain your blood glucose levels when your muscles are using up all that fuel. Cortisol, which is commonly known as your stress hormone, that's increased with exercise. that can be positive, it can be negative, because it increases fatty acids usage, so the release of fatty acids, which then can be used as energy, so it's going to help with fat loss. But then it also elicits protein breakdown. So some protein breakdown is fine because we need to break down new tissue to rebuild it, but we don't want too much. So controlling cortisol is an important consideration for dieting, especially if you're putting someone under dietary stress, and it also decreases glucose uptake as well. And then we have epinephrine, which is kind of a version of adrenaline, I guess, which is increased with exercise, and that increases glycogen breakdown. So it has a comparable effect to glucagon in the sense that it's going to help maintain blood glucose levels, so that can be used as fuel to then be replaced from your glycogen from your liver. And then we have norepinephrine, which is increased with exercise again, and this increases fat breakdown. Increases your heart rate, and it's one of the signals to get that immediacy in that increase in heart rate we talked about earlier when we're exercising, and obviously then glycogen breakdown as well. So our body's really, really keen on maintaining blood glucose level and providing glucose, particularly for high intensity exercises. Okay, so that's why a lot of these hormones are really important for breaking fat down and actually breaking down glycogen. There's a couple we need to watch out for. Mainly cortisol and the following one, because they can also have implications on protein as well, and the storage form of protein in the body comes from muscle tissue, so we don't want these things elevated too high for too long, because that can actually lead to muscle loss. Okay, so your thyroid hormone, so with exercise we get an increased conversion of T4 to T3, which makes sense because T4 is the inactive version and T3 is the active version, so if we need more energy we need an increased conversion. But this seems to be dependent on the nutritional state, so this will be dependent on how much energy your body actually has. So we'll get more of an increased conversion of T4 to T3 if we've got more energy in our system. If we haven't got as much energy in our system, if we're on a calorie deficit, we're going to get the opposite effect. So we can actually affect our thyroid hormone by our nutrient intake. Again, this is an important thing to consider, and we're going to talk about this in a lot more depth. I'm going to cover this in quite some detail later on. Okay, and obviously thyroid hormones, it breaks down glycogen. Great, maintains blood glucose levels, breaks down fatty acid, great for fat loss, but unfortunately when it's elevated too high and when we desperately need it, it can actually eat up protein for energy. So that's one of the reasons why your thyroid levels fall when you diet, because it's trying to preserve muscle protein. Because muscle protein is important, your body doesn't want to lose that. It will quite happily break down glycogen, it will quite happily break down fat, but your thyroid levels will reduce to actually help preserve protein, but then by trying to reduce itself to do that, you're actually inhibiting how much fat you can actually burn as well. So this is this balancing act the body's trying to maintain. You remember I talked about survival driving processes. This is one of them. Our body doesn't want to get very lean, okay? So when we do something like put it on a massive calorie deficit, one of the things we're doing by putting it on a massive calorie deficit is we're going to actually put it in danger of using protein for energy, so our thyroid levels will drop. When our thyroid levels drop, then we're not going to use fatty acids as effectively, we're not going to use break down glycogen as effectively, so we have this knock-on effect where actually we're in a massive calorie deficit, but metabolism's getting slower and slower and slower, so we need to push harder and harder and harder to get that same fat loss, and that's what happens. That's why weight comes off people quite quickly initially, but as their body fat gets lower, there's other hormones involved as well. But it's one of the reasons why, as our body fat gets lower, we then need to start decreasing calories more and more and more at each sticking point, as opposed to just having a set calorific level where people will lose fat as well. So that's something to watch out for, and we'll talk a little bit later on about in the other modules about how to strategies to watch out for this and things we can do to stop that taking place when we are designing nutritional strategies for either ourselves or other clients. Okay guys, so now we're at the end of the module video. I'd just like to thank you for listening again. If there's one thing I would encourage you to read up on really as a sort of baseline before we move on, would be the endocrine system. The reason for this is I think it's a massively underlooked component within the fitness industry and within current fitness industry training. So your normal training for being a personal trainer, particularly in the UK as I understand it, and in other countries that people have come across, they tend to really underestimate the importance of this. And the reason I think it's important to read up on, and there's a reason why I kept saying throughout this video I'll talk about this in greater depth later on, which I will, is simply because there's so much of your body's systems are governed by these processes, and if you can understand these processes, it's going to make you a better trainer, because not everyone is just a client that's really easy to work with. You know, I'm sure those of you who are experienced trainers already will know there's people who struggle with fat loss, struggle with weight gain, they struggle with adherence to their diet. And some of these things, well, most of these things can actually be governed by their endocrine system and their hormonal system and hormonal imbalances. So if you can get an understanding of those things, then it means that you're going to become a better trainer. You're going to become more marketable because you have, one, the marketing tools to tell people you have this understanding, and secondly, you're going to be able to have the toolbox to actually deal with these issues. And once you have that toolbox and you've worked with some stubborn clients and you start getting those recommendations from having worked with those people who never had results before because you've gone the extra mile and read this stuff, then that's only going to be better for you in your business if that's what you do. And from an educational perspective, it's something that I'm going on to personally to get further qualifications in, because I've done my own reading on it now, and now in a position where I want to go and get higher education qualifications directly within this field, because I think it's something that is that important and will separate the wolves from the sheep, as it were, in the future of the fitness industry. So, like I say, thanks again for listening, and I will hear from you, or you'll hear from me, next time you click play. Happy learning.